Hello and welcome. We're going to give this just a couple more minutes just to make sure that everybody has a chance to come on in and get settled. And then we will get started with DevOps and pipeline runners, the key to sustainable app development. Thank you guys for joining us. All right, so welcome. We are going to give this just 2 more minutes just so that everybody can get settled. And then we'll get started with this webinar. Just as a reminder, we always have DevOps office hours weekly on Wednesdays from noon to 1 p.m. And I'll say this a couple times as we go throughout this presentation, but just making sure that if there are lingering questions at the conclusion of this webinar, then you are welcome to join us for those office hours either today or next Wednesday or the Wednesday after that. We are always happy and here to answer your questions. All right, it looks like we have everybody. Hi, Mick. So I am going to kick off this presentation. My name is Heather, and I will be your host and the moderator for this event. And I just want to take a couple of moments here to introduce the webinar and our incredible panelists. So welcome to the first of Batovi's Leadership in App Development webinar series. We plan to continue these on a monthly basis. So if you like this one and maybe want to look into project management, UX, UI design, React, Angular, all of those things, we're going to be kicking off webinars for each of our departments here at Batovi. So I'm Heather, I'm your host for today, and I'll be monitoring the chat throughout as well. So if you have questions as we go, please feel free to throw those in the chat, and we'll have a Q&A session at the conclusion of our panelists' discussion. Today, we're joined by 3 panelists. Mick McGrath is the Director of DevOps for Batovi. Chris Capel is a DevOps consultant with Batovi, and Ryan Good is the Senior Manager of Site Reliability Engineering with Yum Brands. While DevOps is a complex function of product development and may be difficult to distill over a short period of time, today Mick, Chris, and Ryan will share their preferred tools, tips, and tricks when it comes to pipeline runners, a key instrument for automating workflows. If this webinar really piques your DevOps interests and you have additional questions, as I stated before, we do have those DevOps office hours beginning at 12 p.m. Central Time today, and I'll be sure to give you the meeting link for that as well. And then I am going to go ahead and correct myself here. Chris Capel, I apologize. I pronounced his last name wrong.
Everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Perfect. So I want to give a warm welcome to our 3 panelists and turn the floor over to Mick so he can provide you a bit more context for DevOps prior to their discussion. Mick, take it away.
Yeah, everybody, and welcome. So I want to give just a quick overview of what we're talking about today, which is pipeline runners. So pipeline runners are, generally speaking, like the backbone of your automated software delivery setup. They're essentially, like, pipeline runners are essentially hosted machines that run actions or scripts so that you don't have to run those locally on your, developers don't have to run those locally on their computers. And so whenever code is pushed up to an application or deployment repository, the pipeline runners will do things like do your continuous integration stuff, like run tests, run a build, publish artifacts. They'll also run deployments. If you have your infrastructure defined in code, your pipeline runner will run your deployments. It allows you to enhance your repeatability so that you have a lot more, like developers don't have to worry too much about like doing manual tasks and manual, again, running deployments or running the tests and things like that locally. You can just push up your code and have your configuration checked in with your code to run those things for you. So you can also have consistency across various repositories, which allows you to repeat your automation setup, which is one of the core reasons that we want to do DevOps, is to reduce toil and automate things. There are a lot of different options around there, around for pipeline runners, from GitLab pipelines, GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps, AWS Code Deploy, Code Pipeline, Jenkins. There are a lot of different ones. There's some that are dedicated to deployments themselves, like Harness or Spinnaker, or like Argo CD or Flux CD, like things like that are like focused on deployments. But generally speaking, again, pipeline runners are hosted machines or hosted compute that will run actions for you. So we actually published a blog on pipeline runners. You can go to patobi.com/blog and check out the DevOps Consulting Pipeline Runners blog post if you want to get more in depth on a good overview of what pipeline runners are, like what they are, why you might want to consider them. And so that sort of sets the stage for this conversation. So I'd like to get into the actual topic. I want to start with asking, we'll go around the room and ask, like, what is either your favorite pipeline runner, or like some key features of pipeline runners that you find really valuable and that you like to work with. So I'll kick it off, and I'll say that I'm quite a fan of both GitHub Actions and GitLab pipelines. They both allow you to check your config in right with your application. So there's just a YAML file that defines the steps that you want to take whenever something happens. So you can create a pull request and run tests on the pull request, and that will fail if the tests fail, so that you can't merge your code in. So both of them provide that. I'll say GitHub, one thing I really like about GitHub Actions is they have a marketplace that sort of predefines a lot of things for you. So if you want to accomplish something in automation, there's a marketplace you can go, and there's most likely an action that you can utilize already for your purposes. And then I'll also say that for GitLab, one thing that I really like, especially once you get into like multiple, a lot of distributed applications or repositories, especially if you have a nice separation between your app repository and your deployment repository, GitLab Pipelines has a really good way to trigger other pipelines. So you can trigger downstream pipelines, and it gives you a nice interface for seeing when downstream pipelines, you can navigate really well. If my app repo kicks off a deployment, I can easily go to that deployment pipeline in the other repo and kind of see how the progress is going and things like that. So those are some really good features that I like about both of those. I don't know that I'd be able to pick a favorite between those two, but those are near the top. I think those are pretty good for an easy way to get started with pipeline runners, and they're both pretty powerful.
So my favorite is the original, Super Mario, of course. He's the guy running through all the pipelines. You gotta love him. But if you look at the cloud native landscape, there's 55 tools listed in there. And you could use one, there's a tool for everybody, and some people are going to be using multiple ones. It just depends on your use case. There's some tools that are really good at doing continuous integration, and there's tools that are specific to the deployment. Smaller organizations, hey, they might be able to, with a simple deployment, might be able to do everything with just a, GitHub, GitLab pipeline. Some other organizations that have a lot of compliance, a lot of checks, multiple environments, they might be better off served by, purchasing one of those tools that are more dedicated to deployments.
Yeah, very similar, right? Like no favorites, just because I'll be diplomatic and that kind of thing. But yeah, the features I look for really are, especially customizability, right? Like how flexible can I actually make this actual pipeline runner to meet my needs and cut out any cruft that I don't need, right? Like, for instance, with GitLab, you have a really good customizability to where, you can give it only the tools that you need to do the very specific type of action that you need. And I really like that, right? Because it reduces the size, time, like you can just be a lot more efficient with it. But then also scalability. I think, we have a global team, and being able to meet the needs depending on, time of day, just that kind of usage allows us to both scale with demand, but also, be efficient with our cost, that kind of thing.
Nice.
And I do want to call out some of those, there's a lot of things you need to be looking for when you're looking at these. You want to be looking at security. It's a big, big part of anything you're going to be doing. Not just how do you lock it down and make sure that, you're secure and only authorized users are doing what they need to be doing, but how are you going to handle your users? A team of 5 is a lot easier to manage than a team of 5,000. So you want to make, is this tool going to integrate into your directory services to make things easier? There's a lot of questions you need to be asking yourself. It's not just, which tool can I use? It's which tool is going to best meet my use needs.
Yeah. So on the security topic, I know that like some pipeline runners will provide ways to integrate secrets into your pipelines. And so with respect to pipeline runners, like what are some of the main considerations and maybe some of the main features that you could take advantage of with pipeline runners to mitigate security risks?
Well, first I want to be making sure where I'm using those, ingesting those secrets. I want to be running those on a trusted machine. So I want to have that either in my data center or in my cloud computing when I'm ingesting those secrets where those secrets are living. The GitHub, GitLab, they provide you runners and they're great for the build, but I wouldn't be using any of my company secrets in there. There's a couple other ways you could do that. If you're Kubernetes, you could use the Kubernetes secret provider, or we have a blog post on using that with AWS, where you're just going through your Helm chart is just referencing a secret, but it's not actually having any of the values. Those values are going to be pulled, through your cluster, which are outside of your deployment. So you want to make sure though your secrets are being used inside your data center and aren't on the public internet anywhere, even if they're just a public runner, because those runners are GitHub, I believe they're shared, and I'd hate to see a memory leak cause an issue, or somebody sets your repo to public and all of a sudden people are starting to see secrets that they weren't expecting to be seeing.
Yeah, and too, like that's where I look at customizability, especially with like GitLab and self-hosted runners. The nice thing there is it's, again, sits within your infrastructure, so within our cloud account, and is able to use the IAM roles that we create to do any like interactions with our AWS accounts, any of our resources. And so you kind of mitigate that security risk by, having to be inside, those clusters or inside that infrastructure and have the permissions configured in a way to allow that runner to even assume the role that you've configured. And so you're going to mitigate that risk right there. And then, secrets like injecting secrets, things like that, I would not put them on the shared runners either. I like the idea of the Kubernetes secrets provider. I think that's, a step in the right direction for sure, if you do use, some of those more public runners. But yeah, I go for safety and security as much as I can, even if it creates that management overhead. I think it's worth it, right? Like to have and to know that like I'm safe with handling these secrets.
And that's the things, as a DevOps engineer that we're handling that maybe the developers aren't really thinking. They're thinking, how do I get the secrets in? How do I move forward? They're not thinking of how do we go through and securely, I hope they're thinking about that, but sometimes they aren't always, they're like, it's here in a file. Just put that file in the code and we're good to go. I've seen it. I hope you're not doing that. If you are, stop.
Right. Don't check in code. Yeah, that's a good tenet. Like good security hygiene is like underlying all of DevOps, like all of what we do for sure. So one last thing I think on the secrets front. So the shared pipelines. And what I mean by shared pipelines in this context is like GitHub Actions or GitLab pipelines provide runners for you. They also provide the ability to, even if you're not hosting the entire product of GitHub or GitLab on-prem or in your cloud provider, you can still define your own runners in whatever compute you want, so that you can kind of hook those up. But there are GitHub and GitLab do both provide these open shared runners that you don't have to have any infrastructure. They're just SaaS-based runners that run on their compute behind the scenes, and they're going to have their own scalability and things like that built in. But in that context of the shared runners, those are really good to do the build. But if we're looking at the CI process as build, test, and publish, that publish often will need some credentials somehow. And so are there ways to mitigate, like say I need to build a Docker image and post it on Docker Hub. I'm going to need Docker Hub credentials to do that. I can definitely put those in the secrets. Are there, like, is that sufficient? Is that good? Because you use a token that you could rotate the token if there's a risk or something like that. But are there ways to mitigate that, or is that, you think, a sufficient approach?
I wouldn't consider my Docker image to be, as long as it's, private. I guess it depends on what's all inside that Docker image. If I was putting credentials in there, I would not want to be storing that Docker image on Docker Hub if there were private credentials.
Right. And just to clarify,
but I think if you put something up, if you're going to be comfortable storing your image there, you've already removed a lot of things, and the only thing you're putting in there is the ability to push.
Right.
And as long as you monitor that ID, I think you'd be okay. I personally would prefer to have, my images stored within my, private cloud, within my data center, in an area that I could control. Even if it was, AWS, GCP, all the big cloud providers provide you with the container registry these days that you can push the image to. I prefer those over, Docker Hub, because Docker Hub is fine for public stuff and fine for maybe, low security things. I would never, I'd never recommend a financial institution to put anything up there. It's just too easy to start seeing code, and, what happens if they start running, somebody runs that container? Is that going to be connecting with my APIs and doing weird stuff I didn't even think about? I just prefer to try to avoid that altogether and keep it private.
Right. And you could definitely put, you could create your own runner, which, as Ryan mentioned, that's, you need some additional, there's some additional management overhead that you have to, like, create that, the virtual machine or whatever it is that's going to be running your self-hosted pipeline runner. And you could bake in your Docker credentials to your internal infrastructure and stuff like that. But for a lot of people, the ability to have that management is quite a big barrier. And so it's luckily there's a lot of encryption and secrets masking and things like that. The biggest risk, I think, to having secrets in the pipeline runner configuration is just if there's, you don't know what infrastructure they have behind the scenes. Whereas if you own the infrastructure, you can kind of, if you trust yourself, more like your internal stuff, and you've got your networking set up so that you can't get into your network, it's, it might be less risky than running things with your secrets on infrastructure that you don't have visibility into how it works, potentially. I want to shift a little bit to talk about, with pipeline runners, like what features are there that allows pipeline runners to work well in like a distributed microservice environment where you have lots of different repositories working together? Like, what are the main considerations when working with a large set of teams on the same pipeline runner? What considerations are there that you need to consider with your pipeline runners?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things, like I was saying before, is the scalability is one thing I'm looking for. Just because, we have global teams, and so, different times of the day they are doing more work than other times of the day, right? Like it's very much distributed. So as far as capacity goes, you want to make sure that you have the capacity there when they actually need it, and so that's where like auto scaling comes into play, and you can be very efficient both in your capacity, but then also in your cost with a lot of those. So depending on what system you're using, so GitLab, for instance, can use spot instances to help with a lot of the cost and efficiency with auto scaling. And then I think it's more of a like, how can I templatize this thing, right? Like how can I make it so that each team does not have to reinvent the wheel to get going, right? Like whether it's I have a centralized piece that they just opt into, or there's a template of a workflow that they're essentially just bringing their service config and saying, okay, now run this service deployment, right? So yeah, those are the two big ones I'm looking for.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree. DevOps, it's about reusability, speed. If we're going through and creating a workflow, we want to be using it as many times as possible, reusing all this code. And we don't want to reinvent it for every single project. That's where you start putting parameters in place. You start writing your actions that you can use reusable. GitHub just introduced the concept of reusable workflows, where you can create a workflow that could be used as a sub workflow within other pieces. So anything you can do to reuse what you already have, make it rubber stamp it. Somebody says, I want a Doom project. It's going to be a React. It's a microservice. Here's the 5 parameters that they choose from, and bam, here you go. We don't want them to be every new time there's a new project trying to find a new way to do things, because that creates a environment where nobody knows how to maintain anything because everything's different. Maybe not as fun if you're not changing things every time, but it's going to be a lot easier to maintain. It's going to be a lot easier to troubleshoot. And, we're going to be spending a lot less time integrating our monitoring and, deployment procedures into your new project than we have, and spend the time then to really work on the things that need to be worked on. Improving our existing processes.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, GitHub Actions and the GitHub Action Marketplace, I think, is a really, really nice way to get started with interacting with pipeline runners, because you've got a good search. Whenever you publish a GitHub action, you can put documentation and details, and those are all searchable from the GitHub Actions Marketplace, so that you can pretty nicely describe what it is you're trying to do. And a lot of them, you want to be careful about using GitHub Actions that are not verified. Ideally you'd work or that don't have a lot of adoption or things like that, because you'd still do, you want to make sure that it's doing what it says it's going to do, and it doesn't have any like security vulnerabilities and stuff like that. But if you want to get started on just like run a simple build of a Next.js app, or a simple Docker build or something like that, there's a marketplace where you can search for those things. And I think that's a really, really powerful feature that they have. And GitLab also has a nice way to be able to share pipeline configuration across different repos. They've got a really nice include structure. And like I mentioned before, you can like trigger other pipelines or pipelines in other repositories pretty nicely there too. So if you're using GitLab internally and you have a distributed team or a lot of different microservices, you can like build some centralized pipelines, and then developers can then, for their microservice, like opt into that. You can have a pipeline for either of these. You could have a pipeline that does something like, you have an app repo that's a JavaScript app repo. It's got a Docker file. It's got a Helm directory. And whenever some new version happens, you publish your Docker image somewhere, you publish your Helm chart somewhere, and then you kick off a deployment to your deployment pipeline in your deployment repo. Yeah, and they also both I've been talking about GitHub and GitLab a lot, and I'll probably continue to do so because they're pretty common. But like I said, most of the other pipeline runners also have very similar features. And one feature in particular is logging and reporting. So you want to make sure that when a pipeline runs, if there's an error, you can easily figure out where that error is, so that you've got nice output logging and and ideally reporting on whenever there's an error, and you can like hook those up to your chat and things like that.
Yeah, and that becomes especially good, important in the deployment products.
Yeah.
A lot of times, not every industry, but banking, healthcare, they have regulatory requirements where they're, need to keep track of what's being deployed, who's deploying it, and you want to make sure you have robust logging to meet those requirements. And that's where a lot of those other tools will come in. I know GitLab itself has some new plugins that'll help with the regulatory, commitments, where you say, I'm a HIPAA environment, I check that, and you can go through and starts helping you with the framework to, lock things down.
Right. Yeah, and so far we've been talking about pipeline runners that are valuable for both CI and CD, like so both build, test, and publish, and your deployments. And with those, you can set off like one-off tasks and create buttons in the pipeline runner UI to do various tasks. You can create pipelines out of those. But I want to shift to deployment specific runners. So this is things like Harness and Spinnaker. And in the deployment space specifically, it makes sense that there are pipeline runners dedicated to this, because whenever you get on the deployment side, you have things like environment promotion to consider. Like, how do you go from dev to QA? How do you go from QA to prod? And sometimes you want gates in between those. And so what are the main considerations in terms of pipeline runners with regard to environment promotion that should be considered?
Yeah, I can answer this. We're in the process of kind of going through this right now, as far as like improving our promotion process. And so we're using Harness for our CD, and one of the big things that they offer is kind of a few different ways that you can gate that promotion. And so the really nice thing is, and this is what I look for, in general, but are the ability to do things automated or manual. I want both, right? And the big part there is you can't just flip a switch and change behavior. You can't just flip a switch and get everyone like ready to just let the robots take over, right? And so you want to have mechanisms that also allow for more manual operations to say like, okay, this is ready. I'm sitting on this deployment call, for instance. I'm watching your dark deploy, your canary deployment, making sure that the new service is coming up properly. Okay, cool. Like all that's done, I'm going to go ahead and hit approve. But then there's the fact that like as you get better and better and more confident in some of your automation and your validation stuff that you can build with things like Harness or some of the other tools, you can start to release some of that and say, okay, cool, we're going to include a validation step after the canary that just runs some tests, via, Datadog or some custom scripts that, hit your new APIs, hit the canary pods to validate stuff, and then automatically go ahead and approve that rollout. And then you go beyond just that single rollout to promotion between environments, and you get all kinds of different tooling, right? Where you can set it up to trigger after a specific environment gets deployed. This, say it's a QA environment, and then after that's deployed and healthy, it automatically goes to the staging environment, and then that gets, promoted up, that kind of thing. And then there's also things with like Jira ticketing you can kind of build in, where it's more of a like release tickets that get generated, and there's all kinds of different ways to do it. I think one thing that I look for is just that flexibility again, to be able to say like, okay, where is our team now, and where do we want to go, and are all of those features, along that path there. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now. Is more in that like middle ground of still gating things as we're working on some of those automated validations.
And one of the other things is that you're going through in these deployment tools that have a lot of gates that can be manual or automated. You want to look at things of how your deployment process works. Can you tie into your change control system to allow this to move forward after the change has been approved? Because you want to make sure there's a step to make sure that change has been approved. Once it's been approved, you don't want to have somebody going through and manually checking to see after this is approved, let's go over here. You want all this stuff to be, automated as much as possible. And that's the whole DevOps thing. I've seen, pipelines where, a lot of things are automated. You enter very little information. If it's, fully, regular change, it's nothing special, just one of those day-to-day tasks. They do two or three things, and the whole thing's automated, including the deployment. Nobody even, the scheduled time, the deployment just happens. And that's where you want to be. You want everything just to be happening. Let's push the big red button like George Jetson and go home.
Right. So there's a good progression, I think. So for folks who are getting started in the pipeline runner realm, like say you just have one app repository, you can get started pretty easily with that with like the open source SaaS-based, GitHub Actions or GitLab pipelines. Run your tests, do your build, do your publish, create a deployment repository, and that's when things you can sort of start seeing the complexity grow a bit. So if you have a deployment repository, then you need to consider things like where are your secrets coming from, how are those managed, do you have self-hosted runners, and in a lot of cases you can still leverage the same SaaS, but then the same SaaS products like GitHub or GitLab, or you can have your on-prem Jenkins and host that, or whatever it is, but you have a deployment repository that you start to need a little bit more complexity, like defining what your environments look like, what artifacts are deployed to each environment. And then like for you guys at Yum, like you're using BitOps, and you sort of started with BitOps in the operations repo pattern, which is a way to like define your environments in a deployment repo, and you have your infrastructure and app deployment configuration all sort of nicely put together. And then as that complexity then continues to grow and you have more and more environments, like BitOps is really good for defining environments, but not so much for automating environment promotion. Then you can start looking to some more dedicated deployment-based runners, like Harness or Spinnaker, where you can start to introduce, this gating and this approval process and this automation between different environments until you get all the way up to production. And like, the golden ticket is you have all of that set up where a developer will contribute code to a repo, ideally would create a version, git tag or git release or something like that. And then, build, test, publish, your deployment pipeline kicks off, your infrastructure, you make sure that looks what it should. And then deploy to dev, run some automated tests, deploy to QA, run some automated tests all the way up till you have Canary in production. And the developer just pushed code and made a version. And now, within this automated pipeline all the way through, your pipeline runner setup takes it all the way through to production. And then, yeah, I mean, you're running pretty fast then. That's the great place to be. There's a lot of work and a lot of, internal concepts to all of these all across that pipeline scape, that landscape of your delivery pipeline. And just about any step along the path has, a pretty deep rabbit hole that you could go in for concepts and things that you should probably pay attention to. But yeah, I mean, hopefully this gives you a good idea of, some concepts and some things to think about with pipeline runners. And, again, we have a blog on this that can give you like sort of more of an overview and some other questions to ask yourself and things to think about with regard to looking into pipeline runners. So check it out on bitogi.com/blog. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a good stopping point. Thank you both for joining and talking through some pipeline runner stuff.
Hey, thank you, Ryan. I know that you're busy over there at Yum Brands here for joining us here at Bitogi.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's
Yeah,
always a
thank
pleasure.
you all so much. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, always feel free to drop those in the chat. Otherwise, as we start to wrap up here, just a couple things to highlight in the chat. Mick mentioned an article that just dropped today about pipeline runners. It's a really great overview directly from Mick and our DevOps experts at Bitovi. So if you want to check that out, it is in the chat. And that, along with our complete guide to DevOps, which that link is also in the chat. And I'm going to throw in the DevOps office hours, the meeting link in there as well, just in case anybody is interested in continuing the conversation with Mick or Chris or anybody from our DevOps team. So that can be found in the chat. And I want to say thank you to Chris, Mick, and Ryan. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us everything that you did in that conversation, because that was excellent. So thank you.